I've got this wonderful badge. It looks like I've just been to the county fair, and I'm not quite sure what I won. Let me start out in introducing the conversations to provide a kind of overview of why we tried to do this and thought it would be a useful complement to the kinds of discussions that we started this morning. I think it's useful to kind of put some of the discussion this morning in context, is to get people to think about this notion of optimism, pessimism that was prominent in what was discussed. Those are historical categories. They're not things that are essential about human nature, and they have sort of different valuations at different points in time. If you think back to those cats who, kind of came on the Plymouth and kind of landed in Massachusetts, those guys, I think you'd probably say, were kind of pessimists. And they managed to do a fair amount once they got here. So I think as you kind of think about our own sort of situation in this historical moment, it's useful to think about why those terms, have become kind of part of our lexicon for trying to understand where we are and why we are in the position that we're in. And I think one of the issues that sort of surrounds that is what was kind of skirted around and addressed kind of implicitly in many instances this morning, is the question of politics. That word was never explicitly raised, but the kinds of things that we're addressing are fundamentally political. And I don't mean to kind of advance that in a kind of a stark kind of liberal or conservative point of view, but simply the idea that as a political body, we need to create those kinds of conversational spaces, as we're trying to do today, and which one sort of thinks about the kind of dynamics about how we decide what we value and how that value kind of gets expressed socially and culturally. So that's kind of part of what we're doing today, and I would encourage people to kind of try to think through that lens a little bit more in complement to however you may think in terms of optimism or pessimism. I think it's useful to kind of go back in that regard to Clarke himself and the way he kind of understood his work in both a kind of political and intellectual sense. I mean, a super important category for him was not, kind of talking about science per se or doing science fiction per se, but it was the problem of change, and change primarily engendered by science and technology. I mean, in that sense, in the way Clarke viewed that, he was fundamentally both a 19th century and 20th century figure. He kind of lived through the early 20th century moments where we had radical innovation and sort of changes in social and cultural life and our industrial life. And again, in the post-war World War II period, a similar thing. That idea of change primarily directed and coming from advances in science and technology was the core of his sort of problem set that he was dealing with. And so I think through that lens you can see why science and technology as nonfiction matters, as things that he wanted to talk about with the public, were important to him, and as a complement, why science fiction was important, right? Because it was science fiction in his thinking that kind of created a narrative or a set of possibilities about what that change might mean, right? And his idea behind kind of exploring possibilities was almost a kind of evolutionary one, in which the idea of laying out these possibilities that came through the act of doing science fiction was a kind of adaptation thing for the human species, right? By envisioning a range of possibilities, one, when confronted with particular kinds of change, might have the ability to more quickly kind of grab onto adaptations that would be useful. And I think, that's kind of the background for Clarke. He had, coming out of a very particular historical moment. So the conversations that we're seeking to kind of pull together now come at a different sort of historical moment. One in which we think about ourselves as fundamentally more deeply interconnected, and through that interconnection, change who we are as humans, change our relationship to other humans, change our relationship to our planet that we live on, and even sort of change our conception of what it means potentially to pack our bags and go somewhere else, as was referenced this morning. So what we're seeking to do through the conversations is to kind of bring in the idea of imagination, not just as Clarke primarily did through the notion of science fiction, but to take it in a slightly broader scope. and to see if there is a means by which we can kind of grapple with our present condition through this thing we call imagination. Now, of course, there is no textbook that tells us how to do imagination. It is not a single method, but a variety of potential methods, and something that is undergoing sort of fundamental change and rethinking all the time. That's sort of part of the process of what we think of as imagination. So the conversations that we're introducing here are less about sort of establishing some sort of very specific sort of concrete notion of what imagination to do, but as the name conversation suggests, provide us with a beginning point through which we might begin to kind of explore both imagination as a critical tool and how it potentially applies to our time now. And with that introduction, I will turn things over to Sheldon Brown, Director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, and he will shepherd through our first conversation. Thank you, Sheldon.
Thanks, Martin. So Martin's set this up really quite well and quite eloquently. The conversation that we want to start off with is one that is directed at imagination itself as the topic. And, you know, so as the director of a center that is studying human imagination, you know, a question that, you know, the kind of central question for us has been, what is imagination? And so when we try to think about the phenomena of imagination, it has, you know, it's not a scientific term, right? Imagination it's like a popular term that describes maybe a whole set of different kinds of things. But there are aspects of our current moment that maybe start to allow us to try to be a little more explicit about what that term might mean. There's ways in which we're being able to start to gain more insight into our own cognition, whether through looking directly at what happens in the signals in our brain, and what happens both at a kind of anatomical scale, but also maybe what happens at a neuronal scale, and how these things start to add up to phenomena that might have something to do with imagination. But we can also start to see a little bit more explicitly what human behavior is, how we might be able to look at, you know, when does a creative moment occur? What did it relate to in the person's experience that allowed that to happen? How does this happen both within the individual, but also at the level of the social? And so if we start to also think about our time as one in which things are so rapidly changing that they're causing these kinds of crises of meaning and understanding, well, is that because there's been an aspect of our own imaginations that has, you know, kicked into a higher gear, that we as humans, as humanity at large, are imagining more things, thus creating more things? So these kinds, and then what aspects of our culture might be fueling that? So these are maybe some of the things we might talk about today. We've got this really amazing panel to help us think through these things and disagree with half of what I said and bring up a whole another set of dimensions to this topic. And I'll just quickly introduce everybody, and then we'll kind of get going. So directly to my left and stage right here is Sam Shaltain, who is an educator and organizational change consultant, and has founded and directed a number of organizations, national organizations, that try to look at the ways in which educators can be empowered to help reform education, and possibly in ways that might help to amplify the imagination and creativity of those involved. Next to Sam, we have Bran Ferren, who many of you heard from earlier today. And just to be, you know, maybe a little redundant, but there's some Bran's done a number of amazing things, but just a couple of the highlights. You know, he's co-founded and is now chief creative officer of Applied Minds, which he co-founded with Danny Hillis, and is the former president of R&D at Disney. And he's an artist, designer, scientist, technologist, entrepreneur, flamingo dancer. I don't know. He's all, you know.
My best.
And so you can see kind of, you know, cross-pollinating all these things that we seem to think are separate things, and, you know, probably kind of come from a central core of has more in common than differs across these different dimensions. And then next to Bran, we have Kim Stanley Robinson, who has written maybe most of the books in the Library of Congress, I think, by now. 20 novels, right? Are we up to 20?
Something like that.
Yeah, 19, 20 novels, half a dozen short story collections, won every major science fiction writers award many times. And in his work, he often deals with things about economic and social justice, the scientist as a citizen, the relationship between the natural and the cultural, and how they reformulate each other. And notable books, his Mars trilogy is a kind of a touchstone for thinking about geoengineering that we're facing here on Earth now, and Science in the Capital trilogy, looking at how our national science infrastructure might respond to catastrophic climate change. And so it's a really interesting set of minds here to apply to the question of imagination. And so I've asked each of them to maybe just start off by being able to talk a little bit more about their work as they examine it through the lens of imagination, and maybe in two ways: to think about how imagination becomes a tool for them in approaching their work, but also then how they think about how their work prompts the imagination of their clients, of their audience, of their pupils. So the two sides of imagination in their work. And so maybe you could start us off, Sam.
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm really honored to be invited and to be a part of this group. As Sheldon said, my whole career has been spent as an educator. I'm also a writer and a filmmaker, and the central riddle that I'm constantly trying to wrestle with is how to help the greatest number of people start to think and feel differently about the most intractable institution in American society, which is the public school. So when I thought about this topic, something immediately came to mind, which is one of my favorite recent discoveries. So I want to begin by offering it to all of you as a gift. And we're going to look at it 3 times. It's a 60-second video. And I'm going to ask you to view it a little differently every time. So the first time, I just want you to watch it without any context and just pay attention to how it makes you feel. So let's roll that video. How'd that make you feel? One word. Happy. Happy. Younger.
Older.
Older. Couple more. Inquisitive. Say it again. Grandfather. We have various levels of age that this video is making you feel. Nostalgic. Yeah. Wet. Silly. So let's watch it again. And this time, I just want you to really pay attention to what you notice in however you choose to define that. So what do you notice? What do you notice?
Well, one little kid didn't go in at all.
Yep.
And the rest of them were taking turns, which was sort of an interesting process. And then they started to, one guy came and down the side, went a different way. They all stopped in the middle at one point. And there was something funny about boring every once in a while. You know, if that was significant or that was a raindrop.
Yeah, the one kid that doesn't participate, anybody in here that has children, right? I mean, you would think, as a brief aside, you would think if you have kids, same parents, same circumstance, that they would be similar, and yet the only thing we know, if we've had more than one kid, is that they will not be anything alike. And so there are the kids that learn to ride the bike by hopping on the bike and hurtling themselves downhill until they figure it out. And then there's the other kid that watches the rest of you injure yourselves and gradually figures it out. So you have very different approaches. What else? Yeah. Sorry.
One child stopped right in the middle of the water, and then the rest did the same thing after he did.
Yeah, there's...
The first children ran through, and then he stopped, or she stopped, and then they followed.
There's definitely some kind of ritualistic, spontaneous call and response going on. What else? Yeah.
The colors and the splashing sound.
Say it again.
The colors of their clothes and the splashing sounds.
Yeah. And what else do you notice about their clothes?
Similar.
Yeah, there may be some unintentional gender conformity going on there, but they're also clearly prepared. One more? Yeah. It makes you feel like they haven't seen rain or water before? Why? I love that comment because, yeah, the comment was it looks like they've never experienced rain before because of like the pureness with which each of them approaches. And yet, of course, we know that they have experienced rain before. So what I love about the comment is the notion that you can be in a position where you can encounter something as familiar as rain for the first time over and over again. One more comment in the back, and then we'll move on.
When the leaders stopped, they all stopped behind the leader instead of going around.
Yeah, there's clearly some sort of, if not hierarchy, there's some level of influence or followership that's existing among them. I'm going to move on. We're going to watch it one last time. And so now this time, I want you to watch it and pay particular attention to the conditions that you imagine being explicitly put in place to allow something like this to occur. What are the conditions that were put in place that allowed something like this to occur? Yeah.
Well, there's clearly got to be a hole in the road or we wouldn't have a puddle to run into.
Yeah.
Also, clearly there's somebody with a camera that's taking this thing. And so the next thing that you wonder is, were the kids brought there and told, go run through the puddle and I'm going to make a movie?
And what do you think?
I suspect they were invited to run through the puddle so you could make a movie.
Interesting. Anybody read it differently? I mean, we can't know.
Can you repeat that because the people on the internet cannot hear the questions in the audience?
You bet. So the observation was, in terms of conditions, you need a hole in the road for a puddle. And there's obviously somebody who's not saying anything who's filming all of this. And there's at least one hypothesis that whoever that person is, and we can guess by the level of the camera that it's a grown-up or a very tall 8-year-old, that they instructed or suggested that the children run through the puddle. And my question was, did anybody actually read it in a very different way? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, my theory was the opposite, which was that they were dressed to experience the environment completely. So they were in rain gear, they could go get wet, and no adult's going to say, oh, get out of there.
That's right. Yeah, so I mean, one thing that's very clear is these kids are prepared to, if the situation should move them, splash through a puddle. We don't know, but my take on it has always been closer to yours, which is not that the adult is telling them to do anything, but actually they're going on a walk and there's a happy accident of finding a puddle. Yeah?
I was going to say something similar, and it just reminded me of a preschool environment where the person who's in charge, the chaperone, is allowing them to be what they want to be and to do what they want to do and just to be an observer. Whoever the movie taker is just an observer and watching.
And so if we break that down by the conditions that make it possible, what would you say that condition was? Freedom? Yeah. And look, we've got a mic coming your way.
We're going to do the mic for the...
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that nobody watched the camera. I think all the kids are just so into playing the puddle. That's kind of freedom.
I think that's a really important observation. How often do we see children doing something and then constantly looking at the adult either for approval or for permission? These kids, clearly they feel they have permission to do whatever it is they need to do. One more comment and then we're going to move on because I'm mindful of time.
I kind of thought that maybe they were on like some sort of scouting trip or a camping trip with their preschool or something like that.
What I love is, I mean, I'm not going to tell you because it doesn't matter, right? What matters more, and the reason I thought of that video with regard to this conversation is if we think about American public education, but we really don't even need to limit it to American public education, it has been characterized largely by a remarkable lack of imagination, and that is largely attributable to the primary metaphors that we use when setting design conditions. Think about it this way. For the last 100 years, in this country at least, and you could say throughout the world, the primary metaphors that have guided the design decisions in our schools are the assembly line and the tabula rasa. The child is an empty vessel to be filled with knowledge by an adult, and the goal of American public education is to batch and queue unprecedented numbers of young people through a system in the early 20th century and into an economy that was largely fixed and known. I don't even want to pass judgment on that design choice 100 years ago. But I think we can all agree that that is not what we would do today. So I would say the main thing that has guided my work has been a search for a new metaphor that can shape how we think about the design of schools. I'm a school designer, and that our work, that means spatially, culturally, structurally, pedagogically, but a new metaphor that can invite us to think differently about the structure and purpose of schooling. And for us, and that video captures it a little bit, it's not an assembly line, it's a murmuration of starlings. And if you haven't seen A Murmuration of Starlings recently, there's a lot of great videos on YouTube. Google it. But you have seen it. It's that like amazing undulating flow of birds where you see one suddenly veer off and it's like a slow delay of the rest of them. And so there's this clear sense of the ways in which all of those birds are very distinct and separate from one another, and yet also inextricably bound in this web of mutuality. Imagine what would happen if the structure of our schools was less designed to affect a movement of children that was more akin to a tightly orchestrated bunch of troops at wartime, and was instead more designed to allow kids to follow their own energy, interest, and movement the way A Murmuration of Starlings works. That's the central riddle that I'm interested in, and it's one that I hope together we'll get to unpack a little bit more throughout the rest of the conversation.
Great, thank you. So Bran, in my introduction to you, I just kind of threw out a bunch of things that you might be accused of being, like an artist, a designer, and the kind of the truth to that, but also the falseness of those distinctions, I think, as a way of being in the world. So maybe you could talk a little bit about where this comes from.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of how to weave an exaltation of larks into the conversation. But anyway, to me, when this sort of question of this comes up, and about imagination, what's it mean? It's a uniquely, perhaps, American trait to want simplistic answers to very complicated questions, and this is one of those.
Yeah.
We want that, and by the way, painless answers. So whether it's climate change, or whether it's cybercrime, or whether it's is AI going to take over our brains, et cetera, it always, well, we need a simple answer. Is it or isn't it? And what do we do about it? But and politics was mentioned earlier, and in this day and age, politics is probably as close to anti-science fiction as anything I've experienced, right? So it's sort of say it and it becomes true, and then base policy on that. I am concerned that we are suffering from hyper-specialization. It used to be there wasn't that much to know. And so the idea of a generalist education seemed like a fairly sensible thing to be able to do. Followed by, as an artifact of the industrial age, followed by the information age, followed by whatever age is next, the notion is, no, there's much more than anyone can possibly know, and so therefore you have to pick something and focus on it, and do that early and specialize early. That usually follows because if you want a job, ... The fact is people are multidimensional, and that's what concerns me about when a concept like STEAM comes up, as if we have to focus on, the science, engineering, math aspects of which are of course critical, but so is art and humanities, and so we now see the STEAM and other movements reflecting it. We seem to be pendulous to the extent that we can never actually sort of be in the middle and have a balanced view of these things. We have to either be at one extreme or the other. And on one level, we have people panicked about how AI is going to take over the world, and at the same time, we're at a dawn of an age where AI may very well cure the cancer that I am going to get. And at the same time, we can't figure out how to build a mosquito, right? So we can't build a robot with the technical capabilities of a mosquito. Right. And it's that dichotomy between the promise, which comes along with the fear of, as well as the reality of, which is challenging. I mean, when you think about AI, which people have been thinking about for a long time, there's some areas where we make great progress, some areas where we make less progress, but the reality is we always have to personalize it for it to mean something. So people take AI seriously when it might be a threat, right? So, okay, now we have to think about it. And, if I had to look at imagination relative to all these domains, it's what computers don't do, right? So if you just wanted a crisp definition for it, it's what you can't automate. And people will say, yes, but you can have deep learning produce things that look just like Matisse's, and yeah, they look just like Matisse's. They're not Matisse's, and they're not an original thought. And original thought is something more than being random. You know, it's not a matter of just throwing a randomizing function into something. And so as you think about it, imagination requires both being self-aware as a starting point and dissatisfied with the status quo, right? And it doesn't matter how dissatisfied you are, and is it a technological solution? I've spent some percentage of my life in technology, and you know, technology is an artifact of our imaginations, right? We keep inventing things because something doesn't work as well as you, or you just say, aha, I have a simpler, more elegant way, or if you're typically American technology, a far more complex, elegant way to get it done. And in fact, complexity is probably one of the greatest enemies facing our future success, because the systems we've created, including our political ones, have exceeded the complexity threshold that is comprehensible by humans, which makes it a problem. And you know, if you wonder why your software doesn't work terribly well, that's why. Nobody actually knows how it works. Teams of people each work on little pieces of it, and it exceeded the ability for someone to keep in their head. You know, years ago, I kind of observed that I was being pressed upon what is technology. And my view is technology is the stuff that doesn't work yet. It's just like AI is the software you don't understand. Once you understand it, it's just software. And you know, the chair you're sitting in isn't technology. It was technology. We had to have a debate. Should it have one leg? It turned out that wasn't particularly stable. 2 legs, a little more stable, but still you tended to fall forward or back or left or right. 3, pretty good if you don't lean 4 out. We've tried 5 or 6. We've sort of settled on 4 legs makes a reasonable chair. Now it's not technology anymore. Imagination is like that as well, because imagination is what's new and which just comes to mind, because you could imagine a movie. Well, what does it take to make a movie? What's it take to do that? Sometimes it's people having an observation of a phenomenology, and then we'll turn that into a technology. Other times it's, well, gee, wouldn't it be nice to capture what happens on a stage? And there's this little phenomena called persistence of vision, which means you could actually show people a series of pictures rapidly, and they would believe that. That gave you animation. You can have a camera that takes that series of things. That gives you movies. So, but it's always about this balance between not having inventions which are solutions for which there are no corresponding problems, but in fact inventions that improve the human condition, or can hurt the human condition, or otherwise address something that is desired by people because it is their creative solution to a new future. And whether that new future is one of freedom and empowerment, or of oppression or control, you know, that's the choice of the people who were put in charge of doing it. It's challenging because on one level, if you find yourself in the accidental role of evangelist about these technologies, it doesn't matter which side you take, it's always attackable from some other position. And it turns out that many ideas, especially creative imagination, especially when we start as children, is fragile and perishable. And if you don't actually nurture it, it's like a little seedling. You know, there's a notion of an idea, and if you can create a fertile, supportive environment, you'll excuse the excessive use of metaphor, but you know, that seedling will grow and will blossom. So does imagination and creativity, where you basically provide an environment where that's a good thing to do. Because, commenting on this earlier, you don't get the behavior you ask for, whether it's in society or in a school or in a company, an organization, you get the behavior you reward. Yeah. And so you have to be very careful to align the expectations of result that you wish with the reward systems that are in place to do it. Because otherwise people tend to, if you say, I want you to be highly creative, and then the moment you do something, I say, well, that's wrong, bad, don't do that again, make sure it works. Well, then you'll know next time you're not supposed to do that. And in large organizations, risk adversity tends to prosper, right? So the idea of as the organizations get bigger, the risk of failure is greater, and whether that's the failure to educate your child, or whether that's the failure to launch a new product, or whether it's, you know, the risk of failure increases. As a result, risk adversity increases, and risk adversity is the enemy of creativity and imagination. It's basically saying, unless you're sure, we're not going to let you go ahead with this idea. Or, well, you can do it if you want, but there will be consequences. And so, as we think through what it means to combine art and science, I think you have to step back and say, why did we separate art and science? This is all sort of the byproduct of human imagination and creativity. I think there's no reason to be more afraid of technology than there is to be afraid of human imagination. And the fact is, both are either great enablers or both can create big problems. And so, to isolate these things as being separate, I think is as counterproductive as isolating fields to be separate. If you say, well, we have to have a test, great, I understand why all of the pressures cause us to want to specialize, because it's easy, right? So it's easier to test a child in science, in a subset of science of physics, of a subset of physics called quantum physics, of a subset of this and of that, than it is to say, well, how good are they at combining scientific theory with creative and creating beautiful objects and making our world better? That's a very hard thing to test. So as a result, we tend to default to what's easy, which is to say what is testable. Now, on one level, testability, reproducibility, is a hallmark of many forms of science, right? So it's how we learn it. Yet at the same time, there is no such equivalent in the artistic and creative domain. And I think as we move forward and we rethink about education, we think about, for the first time, we're being seriously challenged, the public, as part of a discussion of what is it to be human? What is it to be that? And, I would recommend that perhaps we spend a little more time, instead of focusing on artificial intelligence, on focusing on intelligence, because it turns out we don't have enough of that at the moment. And so it's okay to actually think about what it takes to be intelligent, rather than just what it takes to be artificially intelligent. And I think if we get, it's not AI, it's I that I'm worried about. How do you get that part of it to work better? I think there are enormous issues with privacy in today's world, where there are giant economic models which are driving away from privacy. So there are many successful enterprises, and I'm not saying with ill intent, with perfectly noble intent, but that are depriving individuals of their privacy. There are people with not good intent that are depriving people of privacies in nations where control of information is important. And I think it's amusing to note that many of the founders of what we now call the internet, the web, all of these things together, it was popular to talk about 15 years ago, and by the way, you can't control it, so it's futile to try. Well, it's been demonstrated around the world that you can, in fact, control it. And so, part of that is an artifact of human imagination, right? So, I think as we move forward in this, and as we think through it, and as we attempt to understand what the implications are, it's very important to understand we're just barely getting started in this. I quoted Alan Kay, friend and colleague, earlier this morning, where he teaches taught a class called "The Computer Revolution Hasn't Begun Yet." And it's important for us to understand that, because all of the chaos and turmoil that we are dealing with on a daily basis about this topic is before the real computer revolution has even started. It's like standing on the shore, watching the waves break in a sunset, and it makes you want to take a picture, maybe a selfie, whole bunch of things, it's great. But to say that you understand the system we call the oceans because you took a selfie in front of, the beach, it's not the same. And to think that we're at the stage now where we understand the fundamentals of these things in a way that gives us a meaningful path forward is simply wrong. We're just beginning to learn. And I think we need to teach our kids about consequences and understanding those and empowerment relative to that. I think our educational system has to, while on one level, accommodate sufficient specialization such that kids are ready for jobs, because that is an important part of what schools do. An equally important part is how do they assume a role in society where they're going to be part of a dialogue that is going to make very challenging and difficult discussions across all of these domains. The role of the arts, we're defunding the arts at the moment, which tends to suggest people think they're not important. Well, Where was the discussion about that? And so I just think that we have to be very careful that we're not looking for the simple, easy answers to big, complex problems. The big, complex problems require an extended dialogue and debate, and it requires a community of people capable of having an extended dialogue and debate, which, as the attention span of the public gets shorter and shorter and shorter, becomes less likely to actually happen. I think that's the thing we should be worried about.
Well, too bad there's nothing to follow up on in what you just described. But I think you've set the table nice, I think, for Stan, because when you talk about things about the complexity of the condition, the ability to kind of think through or look at contradictory ideas that are interplaying with each other, I think of how the novel has been one of the great forums for our civilization to take those kinds of challenges on with. And science fiction, I think, has played a very particular role in the last 100 or so years in giving us this forum for us to think about the what-ifs of what we're doing technologically, socially, existentially. And so Stan, maybe you could take a moment to reflect on your work as a novelist in relationship to this moment, in what you think the novel is doing, what you're trying to do with it, and
sure, it's my pleasure to try, because that's what I've been doing for my entire life at this point. But I want to start by suggesting that imagination is a term that is too large to get around, and so we're trying to fine it down a bit today and always, that we are always in imagination, and it's what we all do all the time, so that it's almost equivalent to saying consciousness itself. And being in the moment and actually paying full attention to the here and now is difficult. You get trained in it. It's a practice. It's exhausting. You become a Buddhist monk in order to live in the present or whatever. But we're always in imagination. We're always living in the past and imagining the future, etc. So that it makes me laugh that we have the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination as a way to try to tighten it down a little bit. And I'm thinking that because it's Arthur C. Clarke, that the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Alien Imagination is also on the barge and probably on the backside of the moon right now doing its work. So it's what isn't there, and we're always thinking about that kind of thing. So then to try to think about imagination more as a term in human intellectual history, it came to prominence in the Romantic period, and it followed the Enlightenment period, where the emphasis was on reason and on logic, that reason could clarify human behavior. You kind of cut the emotions out of the picture and be reasonable, and you get the Enlightenment. And then the Romantics came to say, but wait, there's more to life than that. And they were right. Damasio and brain science recently has shown that reason is a very emotional business, that the two are a false dichotomy and that you need both. But when the Romantics, English Romantics, were talking about the importance of imagination and fancy, they were trying to say that emotions were important in reasoning, and that we needed also to be paying attention to what's not there, as well as to what's right in front of us and what seems possible. So I think of Coleridge, that in order to imagine, you have to have a willing suspension of disbelief. So to reverse that, you would say you would have to believe that something that isn't present can still be possible. So you have the willing suspension of disbelief, which is crucial for fiction, crucial for novels. You suspend your disbelief and then you drop into the dream of the narrative and you're there. And then the other thing is Keats, negative capability. And what Keats meant by that was you can get out of yourself for a while, be someone else. You can empty yourself, and this is the negative part of it, that you're not there, and something else is there to take its place. So these I think, are the mental operations that are taking place when we think about what imagining is. And then science fiction is another way of saying, imagining something that's not there, but it's future directed. And again, this is one of the most common things we do as human beings. We are all science fiction writers. We're trying to imagine what will happen in our own personal future. And then the social future and the planetary future are secondary effects of your own personal future, so that you have hopes and fears. If you do certain things and they turn out right, you will get to a better place. So you go to college, or you try to further your prospects in one way or another in the hope that it'll get better. Then in the fearful hours, insomniac hours, you're thinking, I've got so many problems right now, they're going to collapse on me, and then I'm going to be in big trouble, the fearfulness. And in science fiction, we call that utopia and dystopia. The hope for a better place is the utopian dream, and the fear of a worse place is the dystopia. And as people are remarking, we have a lot of dystopias in popular culture right now, partly because they make for spectacular movies with lots of explosions and car crashes, and partly because we have a lot of fears right now. But utopia keeps coming back. It's always there because we're always hopeful. We always hope for the best. So another thing science fiction does distinguishes it from fantasy, which is also very imaginative. But science fiction sets the constraint of the reality principle. What's really possible in the future, not just can anything happen. And H.G. Wells, science fiction founder, has a very great phrase, where anything is possible, nothing is interesting. And this is the great hammer blow to most fantasy, where if I swing my magic wand at you and it knocks you to the far side of the room, but then your magic wand hits me and it cuts me off at the knees, and then I throw my magic wand at you. And so you have Harry Potter, and you even have Lord of the Rings. And fantasy is very popular right now also, because I think the reason fantasy is popular is because you look back to a simpler time where the villains are not you and the good guys are you, and you can go at the villains and actually chop off their heads. And you get to ride a horse and swing swords, and you get to be in the forest. And this is young people who spend their time inside boxes looking at screens, and the dream of the forest gets back to them, so there's an appeal to fantasy. Also, fantasy is about feudalism. Science fiction is about capitalism and post-capitalism. Maybe people are feeling we're in a feudal time, and that the residual power of feudalism never went away and is coming back to eat us, and so you want to get on your horse and go chop off some heads. But science fiction is about the future and what might come next, and it has constraints, as Wells suggested. What can really happen? Well, when you look at that, it gets quite weird, because what could really happen from this moment in history ranges from a terrible fate, a mass extinction event, where human beings will be dragged down into a kind of some form of a dark age. On the other hand, it could go into a utopian future where we solve our problems, get into a sustainable relationship to our own biosphere, and have a peace and prosperity for not just us, but all the other big mammals that are being driven extinct. That could happen from the now. With that kind of spread of possibilities, what do you do? Well, I myself, I write one science fiction novel after another, but I think this is just a kind of an artistic elaboration of what we're always doing. We look at the whole spread, and then the science fictional operation, and I'll end with this, is just to do a very old genre, prophecy. Because prophecy is not prediction. Generally, in Old Testament prophecy, it's not saying this is going to happen. It's more of an if-then. If you continue in your sinful ways, things will go badly. Or if you live right with the laws that have been given you, things will go well. So prophecy is an if-then statement, and so is science fiction. It has that ancient power of prophecy. It has the if-then structure to it. So anytime you have a futurologist or a futurist, the non-fiction science fiction writer saying, this is what's going to happen, they're usually asking you for lots of money. It's a scam structure. Science fiction is not a scam. It only asks you for $10 to get entertained for several hours. It's a good deal. And what you get out of it, though, is the if-then of this could happen, and therefore let's contemplate it. And then the ultimate result is very simple. If we do good things now, good things are likely to follow in the future. And it's not entirely true. You can do good things, and you can have a public health revolution that reduces infant mortality by a stupendous amount. A 19th century achievement in medicine and in public health and in sewage control, et cetera, in infrastructure building, civic design. And then the unintended consequences of suddenly the population goes from 1 billion to 8 billion in a snap of the fingers. And now we've got beset with a number of new problems that are unintended consequences of a good thing that we did. So it is complicated, as Bran said. There are no simple solutions. But the operation of doing science fiction, which is already inherent in us and personal, the more you can articulate it to yourself like I've just done, I think the more powerful of a tool, the more leverage you can bring to bear with it.
Yeah, I think that, really very insightful way to think about kind of the value, the cultural value that science fiction does bring. That often it is tries to get reduced into these very simplistic things. This science fiction writer predicted this and that and the other thing, and I know a few science fiction writers who will say, of course that's not the point, but by the way, I predicted this and that and the other thing.
I do that a lot.
And but this idea that, just to go back to one comment you made about how that we are always living in our imagination, that without our imagination, reality just doesn't make sense, that our perceptions of the world are just so fragmented. They have too much signal in some places and not enough signal in other places. And it's our imagination, it's our set of expectations of what's nearly to come with our experiences of what just nearly happened that allow us to form this kind of view of reality that has a kind of laminar flow to it. However, we all live in imagination, but there are these mechanisms and people who seem to, really have who it's their stock and trade to be imaginative. And I think and that's the stock and trade that you all represent. And something was brought up, I think, actually for both of you about, when I think about the work that you all do, is that often you're brought into situations or conditions, or at least I'm imagining you are, where you're brought in to be kind of disruptive. That here's a company or a school district, and they want, darn it, they need to be more imaginative. And so so you're brought in to stir it up, to bring an orthogonal perspective. And, and what is that value of that kind of outsider coming into a condition to bring imagination to it, rather than the thing you were describing, Bran, about be creative, get out of that box, get into that box kind of situation. Maybe you want to talk about how this works with applied.
Well, people, just as organizations, get stuck. And whether that's a writer's block, if you the harder you think about it, the less that comes. Whether it's an artifact of large successful enterprises where they get really good at product quality, really good at understanding customer relationships, really bad at innovating quickly. And so they will notice that the world is passing them by and they could be disrupted. And there have been many great books, such as Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, that point out the complexity of remaining competitive in a marketplace. And that can incidentally be personally competitive as well as corporately. So often companies such as ours are in the role of come in to get some more interdisciplinary cross-domain thinking involved, because we cover a whole variety of different fields, and that's why we're called. You don't go to the best company in a given field you're working in, and they're often the ones that call to teach them how to do what they do, right? They are the experts at that, and they're great at it. At the same time, that often limits their perspective and view, because generally speaking, organizations tend to hire people they like and make it uncomfortable for people. They don't like to work there, so as a result, they tend to all start thinking the same way after a while, unless you work really hard at preventing that from happening, and even then it's challenging. You know, we've had civilization for thousands of years. How many 1,000-year-old companies can you think of? How many 500-year-old companies? How many 250? How many 100, 150? And the answer is, when you start getting to the 250, the 150, the 100, you can think of some, a few, but considering how many millions of companies and enterprises there have been, that's not a lot. So I think part of the challenge is how can you help? You, by showing up, often trigger the immune response of that organism. And so they will pretend that they're a white blood cell, as we saw earlier, an intent to engulf and destroy you. That's part of the art of helping people disrupt and think in different ways. But I think the challenge is just simply getting unstuck. How do you get from the place you are, especially when you're being successful? Success is a curse, right? Because if you're unsuccessful, or if you're in a fight for survival, everybody behaves differently, then why are we spending all this time and energy? Everything's great, our sales numbers are great, or our audience is great, or our ... is great. So that's the challenge, is how do you get ahead of it so that you don't have to be at the point of crisis before you decide it's time to do something different?
Well, but maybe kind of flip some of those terms around and look at in the work that you're doing, Sam. You know, we point out that the schools, you know, we could probably say that's the successful things public schools do. You know, I mean, look at how many kids we educate, and look at how well our world actually does function on the basis of the education of these great number of kids that, you know, a few hundred years ago we wouldn't have bothered even attempting to take this many kids that deep into an educational process. But at the same time, there's this kind of general sense that it's broken, it needs to be better, why are we doing it this way? So here is a kind of outside agent, I imagine, that part of your job is to come in there and be orthogonal to those processes and methods and come up with and do the kind of disruptive thing that Bran's talking about. Is that pretty much how it works?
Yeah, actually, so the question reminds me of something. So a few years ago, I wrote a book where I spent a year in 2 DC schools, a first-year charter school and a 90-year-old neighborhood school. And really, it was the kindergarten classroom in the first-year charter school and the third-grade classroom in the neighborhood school. And the interest for me was in being able to truly be a fly on the wall to get a sense of what those 2 very different experiences are like. What's it like to start a school from scratch? And then the reason I was interested in third grade is, what's it like to be a neighborhood school teacher at the beginning of the high-stakes testing churn? So fast forward to almost the end of the year, and I'm sitting out on the playground with one of those third-grade teachers, and the kids are playing at recess, and she's in a moment of repose. And I ask her, which I hadn't yet asked her all year, what do you make of this high-stakes testing obsession? And you heard Bran talk about a little bit about the fact that we're like the guy in the parking lot who's lost his keys over there, but is searching here because the light is good, right? So we overemphasize literacy and numeracy because we feel we have a sense of how to measure those things. And it's not that they're not important, it's just that they're overvalued. So I was curious what she thought about all that. And what she said, which to me sums up the role of the outside actor and both the problem and the opportunity of the current state of education reform, is she was like, we play the game so they can be players in the game. And I thought, that's exactly right. And no, sorry, that's not good enough. And it's especially not good enough because, as we all know, the game that has been played is no longer the game, right? I mean, Harvard and Stanford and Arizona State, of all places, are some of the institutions that realize this, that the way that we've done it in the past of 45-minute classes and AP and grade point averages and letters of recommendation, it's not actually getting us to the essence of who these people are. So there is a need to get away from the old notion that this is the game we must play so they can be players in the game, because it's actually doing those young people a disservice. So the challenge, as always, is thinking, you don't get, as an outside actor, you don't get anybody to do anything in life, right? That's just not how people work. So I would say what we do is we try to create the greatest likelihood that the greatest number of people in a community will have the chance to start to think and feel differently about their work in ways that will open them up through their own epiphany to not only the things that need to be reimagined about education, but the things that can anchor us that are evergreen and provide ballast. One of the most common questions we ask in the communities we work with, and we ask it of parents and educators. First question, why did you choose this school to begin with? Why did you choose to send your child to this school? Or why did you choose to work here? And then most importantly, what keeps you here? Because that's a question that is able to anchor what's already working. And there's lots of stuff that is already working in schools across the country. Most schools, we have this idea that like schools are failing. Most schools are pretty good. There are very few schools, I'm in schools all the time. There are very few schools I would say that are truly great and very few schools that are truly horrible. Most schools are pretty good, almost bad, and pretty good, almost great, right? So the challenge is to move people along the pretty good continuum. That question is the first part. And then the second bit is, all right, so imagine it's 5 years from now, and whatever needed to happen at this school, it's happened. You're better than ever. You've amplified all of your strengths. You've shored up all of your weaknesses. And together now, we get to construct a photo album of that ideal future. But because it's a photo album, you only get to contribute one snapshot. So you can't describe everything. You can't speak about it in the totality. Just what's that one picture that for you signals to the rest of us what is going to be your most deeply held aspiration? Because if you can uncover what a community feels is most precious about the work it's already done, and which vision of the future is most widely held and shared, anything's possible.
So let me kind of circle back a bit to maybe something about the condition of imagination in our time. And so, while we're in the, I think what I call the neonatal period of the computer age, and you've called the very beginning of the Moore's Law, curve here. But we, the last couple of decades have seen really a tremendous shift in culture and social structures. I know when I was starting to do my work as an artist in the late 80s using computers, everybody thought I was, this was going to go nowhere. Using computers to make art, why would you bother to do that? Now, computation is the underpinning of most of our cultural forms and discourse, whether how it's created or how it's disseminated. So we have transformed quite a bit, and I think it kind of shifts. One of the shifts that's happened is the nature of expertise. What do we need to know? What do we need to learn? I fixed my car engine a couple weeks ago without knowing how to do anything about auto mechanics because I can watch YouTube videos and use a socket wrench. That was the thing I needed to learn how to use, was a socket wrench, right? So the nature of expertise changes. The nature of what we need to try to impart in education changes. The ways in which we can act changes. And so how do you reflect in maybe a larger sense, what has this done to our own abilities to imagine? And so I think in your work, Stan, just even again, kind of going back to the nature of the act of writing, the charge for the novelist, in kind of simple ways, I think J.G. Ballard was talking about the difference between writing with a typewriter versus writing with a word processor, and how he kind of, what scope of a thought that he had at a time and where he paid attention to things.
The books get longer. Well, I want to generalize from my specific practice just for the sake of this conversation and suggest that you can get better at imagining the future. And I don't mean more accurate at your imaginations of the future coming true. I mean you can make them more articulated, because change has a structure or structures. Rates of change can be called out and specified. So Moore's law, which is Moore's observation that chips get half the size every 2 years, that was a straight line extrapolation, we would call it in science fiction, where things just keep changing at the same rate forever, and off it goes into the future, and you can just track that story and tell that story. But the problem is that never happens. And Moore's law is not a law, it's an observation, and it covers maybe a couple of decades, and it will fall apart, and it's already falling apart. And what happens is the ability for chips to get smaller is restricted by the laws of physics, and at a certain point it can't go any further. So at that point it begins to slow down. So that's one kind of change. Things are going along, and then they reach their physical limits, and then they begin to slow down in a kind of asymptotic curve at the top. The opposite thing also happens when resources begin to get developed to the point where there's some synergies that allow things to expand quickly. There's the hockey stick curve of things going up faster and faster in a big curve upward if you were to graph them over time as the horizontal. And that has happened with human population recently, for instance. And if you follow those graphs and say, well, things are changing so fast in computers that in 10 years we're going to have a singularity and we're going to pop off the charts and never even understand as history is taken away from us by our machines. But the problem is these kind of extrapolations, it's exactly like saying because of the human population expanding as fast as it is, in about 40 years, the population of the Earth will be something like, at the curve it's going, something like 600 billion people. But wait, that can't happen. At some point you're going to hit that curve at the top. What you get is the logistical curve, the S curve, and you can look that up, and that's where things are going along, then resources are marshaled, and you begin to change faster, and you begin shooting upward, and then you begin to flatten off at the top where the resources run out. It's partly population dynamics out of ecology. So once you know these structures of rates of change, when you begin to imagine the future, you can say, but wait, a techno-optimist or someone, again, doing a sales job of saying things are changing so fast that they will change even faster in the future, you can always say, but wait, when are you going to hit the point of decreasing returns? And so you can at least articulate your imagination of the future by structuring it in this kind of XY graph way, a kind of scientific contemplation of change itself. Then when you get to human history, what you can't do very well is destrand all of the things going on at once. World hunger versus increases in artificial intelligence versus disease vectors versus spread of nuclear weapons. They're all going on at once. Some of them might be tailing off, some of them might be increasing. Very hard to tell in this moment. And so you get what is, the reason I'm saying you can't predict the future is because you have too complex of a situation to model or to predict accurately. So then you get modeling exercises like out of climate studies. Let's set these parameters and run the computer for a while, which in this case would just be our own brains, our own imagination. Let's imagine this, let's imagine that. And slowly but surely, you are always, hope, this is the science fiction operation, drawn back to the present with new eyes, saying, well, but here we are now, what do we do right now? And hopefully the modeling exercises of we could become this, we could become that, will give a new way of looking at right now, like you're looking at right now from the future. And this term, the Anthropocene, is a very science fictional term. It's saying that when humans or other creatures look back at Earth's geological history from 25 million years from now, they will see a change at this moment inscribed into the geological record of the Earth itself. that has been created by something, which we know to be human beings and human history. So the idea of the Anthropocene is a very science fictional notion. It's very much about these issues. And it comes back to something I've been saying for a long time, that we're all in a science fiction novel now, that we're all co-authoring together. But as I've said, it's not predictive. It's just a clarification. Let's put it that way. We can imagine our way to a little more clarity.
Yeah, and I think the author of our science fiction novel has a very perverse sense of humor, I think.
Oh yes, our world novel is getting quite weird. Surrealism.
And so maybe I kind of keep the question kind of circulating this direction about how our imaginations are maybe being impacted, maybe should be further impacted by the kind of new digital cultural methods that we have right now. You know, where are we not really exploiting these things quite well enough yet, and what might we do to develop these things further?
I think there's an interesting amplification that takes place, and that is once you can imagine something to be possible, it starts one process. Once it actually happens, it starts another process. It's interesting when you look at something. When I was a kid, no one could break the 4-minute mile. The notion is this was just a fundamental limit of human performance. You can't do it. And then sometime some guy or gal broke the 4-minute mile, and then 20 minutes. Thank you. From that moment on, now it's routine. 4-minute mile, no big deal. Because understanding it's possible and believing it can be done, knowing it can be done, changes your frame. And it changes your frame in terms of human performance. It changes your frame in terms of what you imagine next when someone conjectures and puts forth whether it's the space elevator, or whether it's laser propulsion, or whether it's a combination of things that just sort of say, oh, wait a minute. Once you start thinking about that, it changes your view. It gives your imagination fuel to move in different directions. And in fact, many of the things that you imagine won't be possible. There's this little problem called physics that occasionally rears its ugly head. And then it turns out we don't know all that much about physics. So every so often there's some new thing that comes up. You look at semiconductor electronics, a little thing called spintronics happened a few years ago. And, well, kind of interesting. A little thing called quantum computing was put forth as a conjecture. Well, kind of interesting. And everyone rises to the occasion to explain the 500 reasons why it can't work. And then one by one, people solve some of those. And then all of a sudden, it crosses over into a threshold where it occurs to people, this stuff really could work. We watched that happen in self-driving cars, where self-driving cars, there were a handful of zealots 10, 15 years ago. There were a smaller handful in the 30s that said this is going to be the future. But executives in US automotive and overseas automotive enterprises, 5 years ago, this isn't going to happen in my career lifetime, so we don't have to worry about it. To 3 years ago, ooh, this is happening. We'd better have this as a feature or else we're in trouble. To, gee, we may not be car companies anymore. We may turn into transportation services companies, and it's all being driven by this. And meanwhile, people who plan cities are realizing you can design cities in a fundamentally different way. We haven't changed for 1,000 years how we think about cities, and modern cities are all based on automobiles, getting them in and out, moving them, parking them. And all of a sudden you realize, well, wait a minute, a self-parking car garage can be 6 feet high, doesn't need to be lit. The cars can park 4 inches from each other, so I can get 6 times as many cars in the same footprint. What am I going to do with all that other space? And by the way, congestion goes down, and pollution goes down, and energy efficiency goes up, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the critical value of the process of imagination, I take your point, which I think is great, that we do it all the time, is that when ideas and conjectures that come from the imagination of others intersect with yours, it actually enables fundamental growth getting unstuck, as it were, whether it's in areas that you think about regularly, you think about for a living, or areas that you just find entertaining, amusing, or weird, and this lets them get weirder.
Yeah, yeah. And Sam, do you, and certainly education, technology is often put out as this panacea, just give them a bunch of computers or tablets or phones or, electroshock therapy or whatever the technology might be that's needed. So, what are more kind of nuanced or effective ways to make relationships to the technological from the embracing and accelerating their imaginations?
Well, if I think about it with regard to education today, I actually do think this has changed everything, but not for the reasons that you think. So the main reason this has changed everything is because for as long as any of us can remember, the fundamental end goal of schooling has been content knowledge, which in and of itself is not something that necessarily begs for imagination to be at the center. Now, there are ways in which imagination can be exercised further down the pike, but again, back to the tabula rasa, it's a pretty straight transfer. I got it, you don't. You got to come to this room at Tuesday and Thursday at 9:30 to get it, and it'll cost you X amount. We're now in a situation where, because of this and the ways in which it is fundamentally changing our relationship to content knowledge, the end goal of schooling can actually shift to the skills, dispositions, and attitudes that navigate a young person successfully through life. In which case, content knowledge is merely the means by which that occurs, not the end. Now, the way this gets misunderstood in education a lot is people feel like the mark of a healthy school is more tech, when actually, I think what this technology allows us to do is reconnect to the fundamental unit of currency that stands at the center of any transformational learning experience, which is the relational bond between adults and young people and other kids. It allows us to shift away from education as being about the what to learning being fundamentally about the who. And that's what I see happening in the schools that are at the forefront of thinking about how to leverage technology in ways that actually deepen interpersonal relationships, not replace them. But it's hard to get people in a position when they can start to see it that way. I mean, a few years ago, for example, I occasionally do stuff for CNN, and they asked me to come on because some state had said that they were getting rid of cursive. And I was like, really? Like, we're going to talk about this? I mean, okay, And so I just kind of shared with my friends on Facebook, like, oh, I'm going on, I'm talking about this. Like, does anybody have an opinion about this? Let me tell you. I mean, people may not be as engaged about mass famine, issues of racial and social justice, but if you're talking about getting rid of cursive in the state of Indiana, folks have an opinion. And part of that is because amidst everything else that's changing, even if it didn't work for you, there's something so familiar, comforting, and steady about the symbols of schooling. And when you start to push against those, you have to be careful about the beast you can awaken.
So I don't know if we have time for a question or two, maybe. We have time for one question. So this has to be the killer question.
Hi, is this on?
Yep.
Hi, Steve Culbertson from Youth Service America. Sam, good to see you again. Question is the role of young people themselves in this process. We had a lot of amazing young people this morning at the Imaginarium. Obviously, we look at young people as recipients. How are we going to fix them? You described it as that empty vessel being filled by the knowledgeable teacher. What is the role for young people themselves in this process as the primary consumers? I can't think of anything else except education where the consumers don't have much control over what they're consuming. And I'm wondering if the three of you could talk about young people themselves as the consumers and what their role is in moving forward to this sort of next stage that you all are discussing. Thank you.
Yeah, so just maybe a quick
consumer consumption, that's not the right model for education. It's a relationship. It's passing on the tribe knowledge to the next generation. So you don't want to put it on that commercial basis. They're not consumers. They're young people learning from their elders. I would say kick them all outdoors. Go outdoors. We evolved to be outdoors. You'll be better outdoors. You'll be saner. You'll be better at the learning you do indoors.
Yeah. Bran, you want to?
Yeah, well, look, I think we have a big problem with drugs, and the internet is one of them. And so the reality is, how do you let people experience the joys, the horrors, the surprises, the inevitabilities of the real world, at the same time partake of this extraordinary drug, doesn't have to be a bad drug, that can connect everyone on the surface of the planet with each other into vast repositories of knowledge, as well as to insight and your future mate and a whole collection of other things. So I think, there's always the question of balance. Again, it's this pendulum. The tendency is to go in one way or the other. So if you're bringing up children and you're educating children, which I agree is a responsibility of the tribe, of society to do, at the same time, it's a responsibility to let them understand balance. So they don't drink lots of soda and they don't eat lots of potato chips, but they can have the occasional potato chip and the occasional soda. I think that it's really a question of balance. And reminding ourselves that while we have these rules of thumb like Moore's law, which is telling us the rate at which transistor densities increase, we as humans and our needs don't change. We don't follow Moore's law. And the same things of family, of shelter, of safety, of community, of warmth, of food, these basic things that make the human experience, as well as, incidentally, imagination and art and design and science and technology. And so I think it's the obligation of how we educate people to show them the wonders that are out there so each individual can find their own path and where they can add value to perhaps leave the world a little better than the way they found it.
Very nice. Sam, you get the last word here.
I would say that I'll end by sharing something that you might not expect. So the first is that just as the future is trans, people, the future is trans, and I don't just mean transgender, I mean transcultural, transdisciplinary. This is the kind of world that we're moving to. And just as that is true, the future of education is learner-centered. When I attended a big public high school in Illinois, not that long ago, it never would have occurred to me that the school was supposed to adjust to me in any way. I understood, as one of 4,000 students at that school, my job was to adjust to the needs and norms of the school. The future is that the role of schools is to adjust to the needs and norms of each person. That's a remarkable challenge. But here's the bit that you wouldn't expect. And Bran touched on it a little bit. I have seen, and Steve knows how much my whole career has been about student voice, I have seen the danger of when the pendulum swings too much in the other direction, and what happens is, with the best of intentions, adults abdicate their responsibility to be adults. So Paulo Freire summed it up best, where he said there's a big distinction when you're thinking about adults between being authoritarian, which is not a good idea, and which short-circuits the learning process, and being authoritative, which is the responsibility of adults as mentors and guides for young people. So to me, the sweet spot is being learner-centered and making sure that the adults whose jobs are to guide those young people forward understand that their job is always to remain authoritative and to never become authoritarian.
That's right. Could I add just one thing to that? Because I could not agree more. But there's a dynamic shift that happens in people's lives, especially if they go through higher education. And the notion of higher education is to get you prepared to go be a productive member of society at a higher degree than if you didn't have higher. Okay. But throughout your entire academic career, everyone around you is paid to make you better and smarter. That's their job, right? Job of teacher, make the student better or smarter. 2 minutes after you graduate, all the people who are going to be hiring you are paying you to make them smarter and better. This change is a dramatic one, and one which I think we might be able to help students transition to a little better.
Well, terrific. Well, thank you all for helping us all get better in this process. And Martin, you want to tell us what's up?
Well, in this great, weird novel that we are a part of, thank the panel again, please. And also one of the takeaways I hadn't expected is that comparative literature is a